Thank you very much, Dan.
Thank you.
And thank you, Melissa, Lori, and Amy, the Hirshhorn and Art and Embassies, for having us. The most important thing on my CV today was not mentioned by Dan, and that is that I was the very first person as a lowly writer without a lot of income to buy Idris's work when he was a student. And so I have followed him with great interest and did follow him particularly in his early years. And then I've been living in San Francisco, he's in London. We haven't seen each other in a very long time. So it's actually a joyous occasion for me to be sitting here with him.
Me too.
This detail of the essence of existence, which is the painting which hangs in the American Embassy in Islamabad, we're going to return to that painting, but we're going to start at the beginning, at the very beginning, actually, if we could have the next slide. Just a word about Idris's background. Idris is a really beautiful name, and I remember thinking that the first time I met him. And Idris is both a mountain in Wales, in the UK, and a prophet in the Quran.
Yep.
And your mother was a Welsh nurse, and your father was a Pakistani surgeon.
That's right.
And tell us a bit about your upbringing from a religious point of view, I guess, and how you came with medical parents to be an artist.
I am a Welsh, Pakistani, raised and born Muslim. My father, yes, he is a sort of a refugee of sorts. He was born in Lucknow in India, and in the partition between the countries, the existence of Pakistan, he moved to Karachi. He was a very young boy, so he had a lot of trauma from that experience, and raised, not very well, very sort of poor on the streets, and managed to find a way out through, education and becoming a doctor, where he moved to Wales, and he started practicing as a surgeon in Cardiff. And my mother was a Welsh, as you say, nurse, and she was a surgical nurse, and he met her at the hospital, and
in the operating room,
and probably in the operating theatre itself, actually, yeah. And this was sort of late 60s, so difficult time for mixed race marriages, especially in somewhere like Wales, especially working class. My mother was a very working class woman. Her father was a butcher, and suddenly she was bringing a brown person home. So you can imagine the sort of shock that happened to him there. And then he had four kids, and I was one of those, the third boy. And, they lived through some difficult times, race riots in Bristol, and moved around the country and finally settled in Birmingham, central England, and that's where I was born and raised.
And how did you come to, did they appreciate your interest in art?
Very much, no, not at all, actually. How did it happen? Luckily for them, I wasn't really that interested in art through school. Anyway, it sort of came to me quite late. I wasn't a natural sort of artist. I'm married to a very natural painter and sculptor. My wife's an incredible artist, but it didn't come, fluidly. What I was trying to say. It didn't come naturally, and I wanted to be an athlete. I wanted to be a runner. And then that didn't work out. I hurt my leg, and that failed miserably, and I decided to pick up a camera. And that is when I realized I could translate my ideas into images and conceptual art.
The camera is indeed very liberating for people who don't like to draw.
Very much so. Exactly. A different way of looking at the world, yeah.
Next slide, please. So this is the very first work that Idris sold, every page of Susan Sontag's On Photography.
My first £800 from selling of photography, and it wasn't even in the degree show, it was in the interim show. It was the January before I graduated in July.
Yeah.
And the position of this work was so unusual because I positioned it really, really low down on a staircase. It was the only wall left that I was allowed to show on, and it was really good. And suddenly I met Sarah walking along, and she was looking at this piece, and we started a conversation, and you were the very first person to buy that work.
And I have had the pleasure of living with it. And so for me, right from the beginning and still to this day, it's been a kind of utopian picture and a dystopian picture. As a writer and a reader, I love the fantasy that I can just take in a whole book, every page of a book at the same time. You know, there's especially when you're a student during exams, you've got a stack of books. Like, if I could just inject it all into my brain. So that's kind of the utopian kind of emotional reaction I have. And then I have a dystopian one, which is, I can't make heads or tails of this book. None of it makes sense. It's so confusing. Because of course there are very few words that you can actually pick out, although there is reference to personal expression in the bottom right-hand line.
That is, yes.
Tell me, I mean, how exactly did you make this piece?
These were sort of some of the earliest photographs, obviously. So, and I was using negative at the time. I was using 5.4 cameras, and I would have the 5.4 camera set up over the book. And I think, you know, being a student on an MA in London, the first time for the first year of the MA, I couldn't make any photographs at all. I couldn't go out into the world. I was never one to sort of go out and document anything, document the world in any way. So I would always try and, I suppose, make images that were to do with the knowledge I was gaining. It's almost like these books found me. You know, most photography students or people with interest in photography have read Susan Sontag's on photography. You know, it's a disciple book in photography. And so I thought, well, okay, can I take the sort of the energy in a sense, or maybe the sort of, I guess, essence, if you like, but to photograph every page and capture in many moments, because there's hundreds of pages, what it would be like to take in that entire piece of knowledge. And I suppose it was more of an overwhelming thing. You know, at college, you like, read this one, read that one, read that. You know, and it went on, the book series went on to using Roland Barthes' Camera Lucida or the Freud's Uncanny, any sort of art book that was sort of, I was told to read, I was sort of gaining knowledge, and through that knowledge, I would make the photograph. So it was almost like a sort of portrait, in a way, perhaps, of the actual author.
And so you'd have your camera on a tripod, on a stabilizing device, and you'd turn the page, take an analog photograph, turn the page.
But they were multiple exposures onto one negative, so I would probably do around sort of 5 or 6, and then change the negatives. And play camera says sliding, and then again and again. And then I would have sort of, you know, however many negatives, scan them in, and then I would work, you know, on Photoshop.
Then you'd work digitally.
Yeah, but not too much. I mean, you know, it was quite basic back then. You know, I wasn't sort of a genius at using that as a tool. And, you know, I think it was just about accumulating time and space.
Yeah.
I didn't see it as this thing. I didn't want it to go to total black. I knew I had to control it in a certain way where I wanted the viewer to find an immediate attachment to the beauty of the image. They saw this book. They couldn't read the words. They were looking deeper into it. You know. So it was just about, you know, it looks like a very minimal painting as well.
I like the idea that this was your way of grappling with the icons of the discipline.
Yes.
Can we have the next slide, please? So here we have every Bernard Hillebesher prison-type gas holder.
Yes.
And one of the many things I find astonishing about your work is the way you take photography and, you know, it's so deeply photographic, but at the same time, this looks like a drawing. You've transformed many Besher photographs into what looks like a drawing, and also it looks like it's spinning. So you've brought movement into what is an incredibly static body of work. I mean, those Besher images in the original are so still and solid, like there's not even a breeze blowing by in those images.
And they are incredible pictures, the amount of time they've taken to, you know, find the right moment. And I think it wasn't about sort of being derogatory in any way to those works at all. It was almost, again, trying to capture the energy between pictures, showing the subtle differences between those images. And that's what made this sort of spinning. You know, it's the same thing taken over many places, but from just the subtle movements of the camera from distance or close up, you just get this sort of slight difference in the picture, which creates the energy, which starts to look like a drawing and a charcoal. picture. But the one thing I think, for all of these works is the relationship that I always wanted photography to have with painting. I wasn't interested in my eye. I was interested in always showing my hand. So that, and so therefore it was almost sort of just drawing with light.
That is so interesting. I didn't even understand what you meant when you first said it. Not interested in your eye. So it's not about what you see in the street and but very much showing what you can do with an image.
Well, it became about sort of, especially moving to London as a really busy city, and the nature and this sort of saturated nature of photography and everything sort of on a tube or, in the street, there's just so many images coming at you all the time. And I think at that point when I moved to London, I wanted to stop taking pictures and then almost recycle photography. It's like, we don't need to take any more. I mean, it seems a sad thought, but we take so many pictures now, we don't even think about it. And even then in 2004, with the sort of the rise in digital photography, it was almost like we could just take as many as we want to and sort of disregard the rest. So I wanted to make a comment on the fact that we can return to something, and even if we look back at something, we can create something new with even more, I hate to say, even more energy, or to take the stillness out of photography and give it energy.
Beautiful. A lot of Barthes and Sontag and these authors and many, many photographers out of the 20th century believed in that photography had essences or essential things that the medium had to do. Do you think photography has an essence?
I think that it, of course it does. I think that in these images especially, I'm trying to find it. So it's almost like searching a little bit. And whether it's, if you think about looking at a book of images or looking at images as we do, you offer, a photograph can point to something. But I think what I'm trying to look at is not at that point, I'm looking at a totality and what that totality can bring. The many, many, many traces of time built up to create one thing.
That's beautiful.
And Blossfeld, maybe.
Can we have the next slide, please?
So
now, you've already hinted about this authorship.
Oh, and I think, and it is. It's also about taking. It's not about owning the pictures that exist, and and it's not. And I don't really want to bring up copyright or anything like that in this sort of conversation, but it was very much about showing the dedication to a work of art. The Beckers spent many, many years trying to photograph the perfect thing, and through typography they collected all these images. And Karl Blossfeld, he photographed plant segments for 25 years in a garden shed. And I was just interested to say, well, if you take all of these photographs and then you layer them on top of each other, what you're capturing is, well, it kind of looks like a bunch of flowers in the end. But what you're capturing is that sort of subtle dedication into something, which becomes almost like a portrait of that person, I think.
Mm-hmm. In these early works, someone might think that you were perhaps overwhelmed by the history of photography, or felt like the author was dead, or that creating an original image was too overwhelming.
Well, at the time when I was sort of especially being at the Royal College, there were a lot of it was after 2000, September 11th, and there was a lot of sort of there was a lot of war. Tony Blair was going to, anyway, all the sort of political stuff that happened around it. There were a lot of artists in the school who were making quite a political work with their photographs, and also it was sort of the rise of the British realism as well. People like Martin Parr who were going out and taking really extreme reality photographs. And I couldn't really compete with that in some way. I had to find my own voice within photography. I think it's a very difficult thing to do, and I don't know whether I've achieved it, who knows. But I think I wanted to try and find a way of making, having this relationship with painting and not going out in the world and photographing the reality or being political with photography, trying to think about beauty and trying to think about, yes, appropriation definitely came into it quite a lot, as it is,
Mm-hmm.
I worked with the Brown Sisters' works by Nicholas Nixon, and ghostly traces. That's what I wanted to capture.
Nice. Next slide, please. So here we have every page of the Holy Quran.
Not to be political.
Yes, I remember you talking to me about your idea to make this work, and I felt immediate trepidation. I was like, okay, are you gonna, will this be protested? Has it ever been shown in the Middle East to this day?
No.
Has it been shown in religious environments, like Muslim environments?
Not really, but before I made it, it was my father's Quran, so it was his book. So essentially it was a comment on my family history and understanding Islam internally, I think. Because I can comment on that. I have a name that allows me to make work like this. It's okay for me to sort of do that. I have a license. But I think that, it still is a very difficult time at the moment for Islam. And I thought that this image would almost bring some sort of clarity to a very confused book, or at somewhat. So if I strip it down, if I just say basically here's 2,500 photographs, 2,500 pages went into making this picture. Now, what does that sort of do? It's quite nice. It looks like a sort of back end of a plate camera as well, with the sort of frame within a frame. And then all this content, this very confused content, especially at the time when I was making it, to create a very sort of simple image. Mm-hmm. I like the funnel in the center of the book as well. It sort of allows you to fall into it, like it's very sort of sublime in that way. And because we can't read it and it's undecipherable, mm-hmm. then we just see it as a book. The power comes from obviously the title. Mm-hmm. Everyone knows then what it is. And without being political, you suddenly are.
It's kind of interestingly demystifying of the Quran and mystifying of the Quran at the same time.
Yes, I think so.
And I look at it and I think of like how those words are being recited and memorized over and over again over the years. It is a very different kind of book, let's say, to Susan Sontag's.
Well, it's supposed to be exactly that. You don't read the Quran like a normal book. You read it a page a week, essentially. Mm-hmm. The same page, the repetition. And something we haven't talked about in the work as well is the repetition that goes in with all the work that I make. But it is, and it's definitely a comment on that way of reading as well. Page after page after page after page, and sort of memory, mm-hmm. taking it in.
Do you think the function, photography has always been a form of visual memory for us. Do you think that's shifted lately with the arrival of Instagram and smartphones with cameras? Have we lost the memory and the history for the sheer deluge, or...
Look, the numbers are incredible. I did some, I don't know how we'll go on to something I'm doing in London a little bit later, but, I think there have been, I don't know how you can actually think about this in terms of number, 3.2 trillion images made since the existence of photography. So therefore, that in terms of space and volume takes you to the moon and back in terms of images. Laid upon top of each other. And then there are 40 million images posted on Instagram a day, probably more. And then, it's unbelievable that do we realize that we're taking pictures anymore? Or when does that point stop? And also the lack of printing as well.
Next slide, please. Then you moved on from words to musical notes. Can you tell what
my mother
prompted that shift?
I grew up around music. My mother was a talented pianist. She never really made it, but I had a lot of music in the house. So there were lots of pages of music everywhere. I grew up with sort of just lots of written music. And I guess that's a sort of memory of that as well. And I also think music is a trigger to memory, and so photography as well. You listen to a piece of music, it takes you back to a place in time where you listen to that, whatever it is, be it a romantic time, be it a difficult time in your life, it triggers something. And I think a photograph does the same thing. So I was marrying the two things. Bach's cello suites was one of my mother's favorite pieces of music. But it was also made as Bach used it as a sort of exercise. They weren't actually made to be concert pieces. They weren't made to be played in that way. They were supposed to be for the mind and body. They were supposed to be studies for Bach to get stronger and exercises within playing, because they're very, very difficult pieces to make. So I was fascinated by that idea, and then combining the two, the fact that you're seeing every single note in one image as well, again, looks like, I love abstract expressionism. It looks like a sort of Pollock, if you like. The energy behind each note is there, and it's got this sort of amazing sort of energy within the image. And you're sort of, while looking at the picture, quite like to say, you titled that The Sight of Sound, you're looking for the sound, I think, somehow, and you can feel it. So I think expressively as well within it also alludes to my hand again. So I was always trying to play with things that alluded to painting and drawing.
I don't read music, but I can really...
You don't need to.
No, you don't need to, because if we could have the next slide, the difference between Bach cello and Beethoven is pretty visceral.
and when he was making these, he was losing his hearing. So it's kind of interesting that it became so dense.
You can hear dun 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 dun. You can see it, I should say.
Yeah, and it's actually the title is actually called "Struggling to Hear," because I wanted the viewer, when they came up to the work, to almost press their ear against the photograph. I know that sounds a weird thing, but I wanted it to be so dense in some way that you were really struggling to see the notes. So this was the densest one. The other ones were a bit sort of floaty, Mozart's Requiem. Again, but it's things experiences that I've had. Instead of photographing those experiences, I photographed the music to return to the places where I heard that music. So they were visual memories, each and every one of the works.
Can we have the next slide, please? We're going to move on to sculpture, but this is a kind of nice transition between the musical photographs and what are musical notes on 4
pieces of rusted steel. So if you take the appropriation, you could think of this as a slight Richard Serra one-ton prop, one of his first works. And I quite like that sort of reference it makes. You think about sort of, minimal sculpture, and then it's got the expressive hand over the top of it. So what I did making this work, it's based on a piece of music called Quartet for the End of Time by Olivier Messiaen. And he was in a concentration camp when he conceived the music and actually tried to perform it within the cell. He scratched the music into the surface of the wall, and I found that very fascinating, to sort of scratching the surface and sort of making those marks with it embedded into a surface. And I rusted the steel for 4 months in the South Coast, and then I made musical templates of the music. On each side of the 4 pieces of steel, I sandblasted layering. So instead of using a photograph, I was using templates of music. So there were steel templates. I sandblasted through the template, which removed the rust. And then I went on with the next template and did that again and again and again until you get this sort of layered up, mark making on the steel to sort of try and capture that experience of scratching music into a wall.
He was a Jew in a concentration camp during World War II?
Yes.
It's an amazing piece.
Yeah.
Do you feel like, your wife is Jewish, do you feel like that...
It was an interesting wedding.
If we had more time, we'd like to hear about that in detail. Do you feel like your connection to Judaism through her gave you more liberty to tell this story?
Yeah, I think so. And actually, she was the first one to sort of encourage me to move into sculpture and move into different things away from photography. She didn't come along and suddenly say, you should layer every page of the Torah, or anything like that. But,
I'm so glad you didn't make that work.
No, exactly. Yeah, I think there would have been a slight touch too far, although it could be quite beautiful. Anyway, maybe one day. But yeah, it did. It gave that confidence, of course. But it was more. Like I said, I think that these stories and especially through learning about art, through knowledge, through books, and through learning about music, you find these stories. And I've said to you before, I feel like they find me. So you can have that, I just found that so fascinating that he was going through these struggles. And if you think about struggles in life to actually achieve, to make art, it's nice to sort of get back
And
to
also, his desire to visualize the music in his head was such that he would scratch on a wall is similar in some way, or not similar. There's a perpendicular relationship to it with your desire to visualize as well.
Yeah. I think that if you think about the sort of, the rusting element of this as well, the sort of the time it takes to get that orange rust on there, and just and to embed those notes, you're almost embedding it within the material. And I quite like the fact that, sandblasting, when you sandblast steel, it's such a violent act as well. Something quite aggressive about it, ripping off a surface of the actual metal. It's and then it leaves something quite delicate and soft on the surface. So it's almost saying that you've got this sort of, steel is very sort of like, especially in minimal sculpture or a sculptor like Richard Serra or something like that. It's a very sort of physical, heavy material, and I almost wanted to lighten it up, and I think that's what the music does.
Next slide, please.
It's a bit of a jump.
And then the next slide again. These are the same work from two different angles, and a work you've just completed in Abu Dhabi. You can see how it. You've moved on from the quartet piece, but you're echoing it. I have so many questions about this piece. It commemorates some 300 Emirati soldiers who died in Yemen.
Yes, correct. In the war.
But what I really want to know is how you made it in terms of the geography of its production. It was sourced.
Yeah, all over. I mean, I've got to start from the beginning, even though it's quite a long thing to talk about. I'll be as quick as possible. Yeah. So I was invited to present a proposal for this piece of public art. There was no real brief. It was just essentially we want to create a memorial park, and we want a sculpture to be part of the park, and that was in January 2016. And I won the competition in March 2016. And when I was told, it's a massive sculpture, it's 23 meters high by 150 meters long. And I was told that I had 2 years to make it. I then, the next day, was told I had 7 months to make it.
And also, it involves also a pavilion, correct?
Yeah, I designed a pavilion.
Okay, can we just see the next slide? Okay, and it involves a pavilion as well as the large scale
sculpture. So the entire park was 42,000 square meters. And I became quite an integral part into the design of the entire park itself. But I made it between Brisbane, Shanghai, and Munich. And it took, it was crazy. I had 7 months. I opened it the date's wrong, unfortunately, but sorry, that was my fault. I opened it in November 2016. And it was a phenomenal effort. Each one of it was basically steel structure, steel core, and there are 900 aluminium panels over the entire thing, which have been all hand-painted and sanded back. There's also text, which has been sandblasted into the surface of the aluminium. So we cast all of those and brought them together and somehow pieced together, and it was almost like a sort of jigsaw puzzle to put it together. But it was quite a feat.
I love the way how it works as an abstraction, and also you kind of feel like they're fallen soldiers somehow.
I think that, yes, it was about soldiers. It was about a country adapting to the fact that they've never been in a war before, and then they were, and then they didn't realize anyway, all of that sort of story behind it. But, for me, I wanted to create, and I think, a lot of the work that I make is about a sort of loss and a trace. And I think there's a very emotional point of this to everybody who will go through losing someone in their lives. And could I make a sculpture about loss? Could I make a massive, huge steel structure feel delicate, feel like it was almost capturing the moment of not falling? Because what you want in that point is for someone to push you back up. So I wanted to create something where you walk up to it and you feel this sort of energy of loss, of losing anyone, and you can relate to it in any way, whether you're losing soldiers or whether you're losing people.
close to you in your family and life. It's just about having that human emotion of just not wanting to fall. So a structure around you to wanting you to push you back up.
Can we see the pavilion? Next slide, please. So at first glance, one might think, well, you've come a very long way from photography, which you have, but it occurs to me that the ceiling kind of looks like an aperture.
Yeah,
and the way you commemorate each soldier is with a little line of light.
Yeah, so this is the pavilion space, and surrounding the glass sculpture in the center, which I made in Munich, funnily enough, with the same company who make the big, massive pieces of glass for the Apple stores. Just want to say that. The most pristine glass you'll ever find in your life. It's incredible. And then I put some Arabic words in the center, which was the soldier's oath. But around the actual sculpture itself, and you remember this was an extremely fast process. It was like, answer this, do this. You know, so creating that work at that pace, no one had any decision. You couldn't say, it was almost like, just do it. You know, it's the most exciting thing I've ever, honestly, it was incredible sort of pace that it happened at, and you sort of, you know, you were thrown into a position where you had to make decisions very quickly. Around the entire perimeter of the pavilion, there are 2,000 tiles each. So I basically brought back armored vehicles from the conflict and melted them down and used the aluminium in the surface of the walls. So every time a soldier gets added, so it was a quite strange brief because it was an ongoing memorial. So every time a tile is taken off and then replaced with the name, and then the light comes on. So eventually it may be, I mean, God forbid, but it won't be, it might be a room of light.
Wow. Next slide, please. So this is a sculpture that you are in the process of making. This is just a mock-up. It's near Tate Modern in London. It's called 65,000 Photographs.
Yes. It is, and I'll hopefully be completing it by November this year. I just literally got this 2 weeks ago. Been working on it for quite a while. It is, the concept of which we just touched upon is the fact that we don't understand the volume of pictures that we're taking now. So I wanted to make a sculpture about that. Can I visualize the amount of pictures I've taken over the last 5 years? I've taken 65,000 pictures, roughly. My wife's taken probably more. We have 125,000 photographs on our iCloud account. Do you know what I mean? It's getting crazy. But, and it's a boom because I have kids, and, you know, it's like,
any cats or dogs?
No, exactly. Imagine. So, and I'm not even on Instagram. But my point is that we are consuming images all the time at a very, very fast rate. So I wanted to see if I could make a sculpture by literally stacking photographs on top of each other. So it's not a great render, I apologize, but I took the very standardization of photography. So 5x7 print, 10x8 print, 12/16, 16/20, 25, 24, blah, 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 to create the sort of structure of it. So I would take all the photographic prints. You know, we cannot possibly print that many pictures. So I wanted to see what that volume of time could look like. So it's a kind of little mini portrait, essentially. So I'm casting 65,000 photographs in bronze and then stacking them up on top of each other. Now, it would be, 65,000 would actually be 16 meters, but I couldn't go up to 16 meters. So I had to do it in 2 bulks, and it's an 8-meter sculpture. In the end, I have no idea how I'm going to physically make it yet. We're working that out, but I think it could be straightforward. So, you know, lots of engineering and design development to make it. But I think the concept is quite lovely if you're looking at this sort of this volume of space and time. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But you don't, we don't care about the content anymore. When you do that, you know, you're casting all these pictures, and literally you cast them. But yeah, I just think it's kind of it's quite fragile, and I like the fact it's just balancing on that 5x7 photograph footprint.
You're re-analoging the digital.
Yeah, to make people aware about that amount of image making.
Can we have the next slide, please? So we're not going to talk at length about this series, but it is in the Smithsonian's collection. And correct me if I'm wrong, but there are 5 images that were initially commissioned by the New York Times, but you have released as limited art prints.
Yes.
And one's the London Eye, one's the Houses of Parliament.
They were made for
St.
commission
Paul's.
for the Olympics, the London Olympics. Yeah, and it was the idea in the process is quite nice because instead of going and I was always obsessed with these sort of tourist locations, how many pictures there are of them. You know, we go and we take them and so many images and we all probably have the same pictures. I decided not to go to the sites to photograph them. I walked around London going to every single postcard and tourist shop and I bought all the postcards that I could find of the location of this is the London Eye, the Tower Bridge and Parliament and St. Paul's. And so I rephotographed all the postcards and layered them up to create the image.
Next slide, please. So Idris has made 4 videos, none of which we're seeing today, because in the interest of time and in the interest of ending with painting. But because Kairos will be coming to New York and Chicago and was met with such acclaim in Zurich and Munich, this collaboration with the composer, and I'd love to know more about this collaboration you did with the composer Max Richter and the choreographer Wayne McGregor.
And it was my first sort of time. I mean, I worked with a dance before in a video piece, and it's the first set I sort of made. But Wayne approached me. He works with a lot of artists when he does sets, and he's one of the great choreographer in London and globally. He's getting a lot of acclaim. And Max Richter, of course, is an incredible composer, does lots of film scores. And he made a work where he recomposed Vivaldi's Four Seasons. And it sort of made perfect sense. Don't take on the Vivaldi, you know, don't do that. But he did, and he managed to do it with such a compelling way and incredible. So he basically did what I did with photography. He cut up and layered up and all the sort of different bars, and it became a very dramatic piece of music. He approached me to then make the sets. So what you're looking at is actually the middle part of the ballet, where the front gauze is every single stave of the music, and the back gauze, which is the square, that's every single note removed from the bars. So you're basically caught in these 2 places, and that's a quite nice word. The kairos is a nice word because it means about sort of space, well, the bit in between, essentially, of time. So then all the dancers became the notes, and then, you know, in the scale of it was quite interesting, the fact that the notes were so massive and the dancers would sort of come in and out of clarity. And yeah, it was a lovely thing to do because, you know, you can't really go wrong with, like, you know, Vivaldi's Four Seasons and then with such a great composer, and then bringing those 3 things together, it was such a lovely thing to be part of, and I loved collaborating with that, and I want to do more.
Good. Next. So here we have a quite different series where you reveal your hand in a very different way. So you use chalk on chalkboard, and if we could have the next slide, take pictures of the process and create these Twombly-esque
that was very
images.
much the image before with the charcoal and chalk were very much sort of influenced by Cy Twombly, sort of, you know, he's a master of painting, and I never claimed to be a painter, but what I quite liked about that process was that it became about the process of removal. So something that in a way a painting can't capture is the entire span of that painting being made, if that makes any sense at all. So what I mean is, to the point of, you have a chalkboard, and I would come in every day, and I would, you know, the one prior to this, over and over.
Back?
We just go back a little bit. This is called Over and Over, and I would literally write over and over, over and over and over and over every day but I would photograph the over, then I would rub it away, and I would photograph that, and then it's basically an image made up of roughly 2,000 photographs. So basically, if you imagine I wasn't happy with the entire word that I wrote, so I would zoom in and just take the O and then the V and piece them all together to create this sort of, in a way, a development of a painting. So it's capturing every moment of the process rather than the finished thing. And then I disregard the painting afterwards.
Is this the first body of work in which you've actually revealed your hand in the old-fashioned sense, you know, your signature, the movement of your hand?
Yeah, very much so. But, you know, it's cheating because I could manipulate that mark and bring it together and piece them together.
Painters always cheat too.
Yeah,
I mean,
maybe.
Drawings always had the benefit of an eraser.
Yeah, no, exactly. And then so the next picture in the studio, this is when I started making it with oil stick. So just having the canvases on the wall and then painting and photographing that process. But I actually quite like the fact that they became photographs, because then I wasn't sort of competing with painters. Because everybody will be like, oh, Bryce Marden's better. But then I could get away with a little bit more by making those kind of images, you know.
Well, I'm going to say something that may be unpopular, I don't know, but I so much prefer and love your Twomblys to the original.
Oh.
Next slide. Here we have something quite different, a departure from now 7 years ago, where these are drawings, but they eventually evolved into paintings, including the one in Islamabad. And you use stamps, and these are actually text-based?
Yeah, so this is when I really, I guess, made the paintings or drawings, where I wanted to find a tool of making an actual drawing itself. And it was a tricky, very, very tricky time for me. I lost my mother. She was quite young, 59, and I lost my wife, and I lost a baby very late on in the pregnancy, very, very late, sort of a stillborn. So it was a very difficult year in terms of grief, and I wanted to find a way of making a very cathartic way of making an image, essentially, and photography wasn't sort of doing it for me at the time. So this is when I sort of started writing. And I would come into the studio and I'd write anything to sort of get away from the sort of grief that I was feeling at the time. So there were little messages or little pieces of writing that I would then turn into rubber stamps. And then I would use the rubber stamp and I would just stamp away. And what I quite like about the sort of patternation that it created was there is a particular pilgrimage in Hajj where it's called the Jamarat, where Muslims take 7 stones to 3 different locations and throw the stone at the wall that is supposed to represent the devil, which rids you of sort of any sort of grief, or you want to get rid of any sort of baggage, essentially. So I was really interested in that idea that if you had a stone and it was full of these words and you throw it at a piece of paper and these words just sort of exploded and splattered over the page, and what would that look like? So then I was using it as a way of, and I think there's the next slide, this is the exhibition. So there were 21 drawings around the room, and it was these little messages and emotions caught in this little painting.
And called The Devil's Wall.
The show was called The Devil's Wall, and these were the 3 sculptures, because at the bottom of the wall in Hajj, the stones are collected at the bottom. So I was really interested in this idea of throwing the stone and these words falling like a well into the abyss, and you couldn't see into the middle of those sculptures. So they're aluminium sculptures sandblasted with text going into just throwing a stone into words and disappearing.
Next slide.
And these are the stamps. I have around about 100,000 now.
How many?
About 100,000.
And how do you decide on your words?
Through research, through reading, through poetry that's sort of fallen on my lap, and then I write, and it's my own writing. One day I may publish them, I'm not really sure, but I see them as the writing is the starting point to making the painting. So in a way, the language is transferred from written text to then a composition of a painting, and then the content. It doesn't really interest me then when it becomes the painting. It's the starting point. That's the way of engaging with paper and pen, and then to then the painting. It's diluted. The content is diluted. It doesn't matter to me in the end what the words say. What I want is the emotion of the picture itself to come across. It doesn't matter that you can read the start of the sentence or the end of the sentence. The central.
Can we have the next slide? Thanks.
Which brings us on to the painting that is now in Islamabad.
Idris couldn't remember the text, but Art and Embassies supplied me the text, and I wish I'd brought it along for us to read, although given that you don't want us necessarily to overly focus on the origin. It was beautifully written, and I thought it was by a Sufi poet, but it's actually written by you.
It's written by me. It's, you know, I like to be influenced. You read the book, you read them, and then you kind of write your own sort of version of what you've read. There's some really lovely sentences in this piece. And you know, I was just explaining the process. I mean, something like this, there are probably about, I would say, roughly 80,000 marks, 80 to 100,000 marks. It's random, but they become this kind of, it takes me about 4 months to make a painting.
And what are the materials?
So it's on a gesso ground, an aluminium panel, which is then with a gesso ground, which I mix, and sand back and sand back and sand back, so you have an incredibly smooth surface. And what I love about gesso is that it really holds the ink into the surface. And so once you do the first layer, it sort of disappears into the surface, then you have to build it up and build it up and build it up. But if you go to the next picture, you sort of see the scale of it a little bit. You know, so you get a sense of sort of the build-up of language within it. And that's both Arabic and English, which gives it a nice patternation. I have made wall drawings that are 5 meters by sort of 4 meters, so big, and you know, and that's nice because you're sort of taking on this grandeur of scale.
Mm-hmm. Can we go back? Just one thing that intrigues me is you felt that this process was more cathartic for you. And I think a lot of people feel that, or just have a kind of knee-jerk reaction, let's say, to kind of the warmth and emotionality of painting versus the kind of cold machinery of photography. Did you feel like that was kicking in for you?
I don't think, I mean, I always tried to make a very emotional photograph. I mean, the content of those pictures had so much energy and expression. I don't think I was ever, I think, no, I think they sort of balance out in some way. I mean, this is about, you know, this is much more tactile in some way, I would say.
There's a texture.
Yeah, and then you're physically stamping. And there's something within that beautiful stamping process where you sort of just completely lose yourself with it. Whereas, you know, in photography, I'm still dealing with a line, a photograph, and a screen, and bringing those pieces together. Whereas this is very much a build-up of time and energy onto a surface. And
can we have the next slide, please? Now, this is actually green, isn't it?
It is green.
Now, Idris has like maybe one very small body of work which is colorful, but otherwise your palette is extremely restrained, and I'm wondering if you suffer from chromophobia. I'm only joking.
No, it's true. You know, I think I think there's a simple answer there, and when I even branch out into colors, maybe it's just one type of blue or variations of green. It is, you know, monochromatic in some way.
Your work doesn't need color, so I
don't think I'm a very good colorist.
Oh,
That's
really?
my simple and complete answer. I don't think so. My wife's work is the most extreme opposite to this you can possibly imagine. She has stacks and stacks of color. You know, and she's the colorist. I leave it to her in her studio. And by the way, we share studios, so we're together 24 hours a day. So I just see all her color, and then I can just go off and be my black and white self.
Well, and it kind of lets you hone in on a different discipline, doesn't it? Yeah. Because composition.
I don't think, you know, quite simply, I don't think that these works, whether it's this or whether it's the photographs, I don't think they work in color necessarily. There's been a moment where I've used paintings, Turner and Caravaggio, where you're not going to make those into black and white. But you know, the others, the chalkboard pieces, or the paintings, if you make them in color, they become a bit sort of browny, and they're not. It doesn't work.
That's true. Layering every page on top of each other, you get muddy brown.
Yeah, black and white strips it and gives you a sort of sense of clarity, and I think closer to sublime somehow.
And final slide, and I'm going to ask one more question before we open it up to the audience, and I do hope you'll have a few questions for us. What does it feel like to be a cultural ambassador? Because effectively, I mean, the presence of this painting in the American Embassy in Islamabad, but also your work in the Emirates, you know, your specific cultural history, you're part of various tribes and families, and that can be very nice.
Not much with the Welsh side yet, but I try not to think about it too much, of course. But you can't help when it's that question of whether you're making a political piece of work or not. If it's not a political piece of work, somehow it gains a political point of view anyway because of my background, because of the kind of content it has. It can't help but have that. And sometimes that's the best way of making a political piece of work, is to not make it political. And then as soon as you ask the question whether it is, it becomes a political work of art. But
and of course, an embassy is an overwhelmingly political environment.
yeah.
It is not like someone's bedroom.
No, it's not. That's true. So exactly, you go in and you think about that work differently than you would if it was in someone's bedroom, probably.
Have you? I'm not aware, but have you made any overtly political pieces?
No.
As a last word, why not?
It's not my first point of interest.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I deal with poetry.
Mm-hmm. And space and time. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you so much, Idris. You were great. You were great. Give me a hug. Mwah. Thank you.